turn back to the book of Titus this morning. The book of Titus, we're in chapter 1. We just started here last Sunday. We're going to make our way through this short epistle of Paul, writing to Titus. We know Titus to be Paul's son in the faith, as he refers to him there in verse 4 of chapter 1, so a convert of Paul's. We know very little about Titus himself, but we do know that Paul, in writing this letter to Titus, is leaving him in Crete, as he tells us in verse 5, in order to set in order the things that are lacking. What things would those be? What things were lacking in the churches there on Crete? Well, as we mentioned last week, we know there were a number of churches scattered throughout the island. We don't know particularly their origin. It's assumed that those Cretans who were at the day of Pentecost heard Peter preach. Many of them, no doubt, having heard the gospel in their own language, got saved, went back home, and churches were started. And as it's mentioned there in verse 5, in every city. So there are a number of churches now scattered throughout this island there in the Mediterranean Sea. But these were churches with some problems. And by the time Paul now instructs Titus to remain there and set these problems in order, some things had kind of settled in. We know that they were struggling against the pagan culture that was there predominant on that island. As we mentioned last week, Paul, in quoting one of their poets in verse 12, says that they are always liars, the Cretans are. They are always liars, they are evil beasts, they are slow bellies, they are gluttonous. They did not have a good reputation. This was a pagan culture, and it would seem as though probably some of that began to infiltrate its way into the churches. So that was part of the problem. But there was another problem too, and that was the false teaching, the false doctrines that were working their way into these churches. Paul describes that, talks about that a little bit there in verses 10 through 16 specifically. So those were some of the things that needed to be set in order. And that phrase, that term that Paul uses there in verse 5, to set in order, would have been used in the mending of broken bones. So it's a restorative process. There was some healing that needed to take place here in those churches. And Paul is convinced that Titus is the man who would be up for that task. Now again, we know very little about Titus and his background. We know that he was a Gentile. As I say, he was a convert of Paul. Paul certainly held Titus in a very high regard. He took Titus with him to Jerusalem some years earlier when he wanted to present him to the apostles as an example of someone who does not need to be circumcised in order to be saved. Paul talks about that in Galatians chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. A little later on, Paul sent Titus to Corinth to deal with the unruly bunch that were there in that church. And Titus had some good success there in Corinth. So Paul holds him, as I say, in very high regard. He must have been a man who was unusually wise and certainly very solid in his character and in his doctrine. So he leaves him here in Crete to deal with some of these problems. But it's significant here as we go on in this chapter, in the next verses particularly, that we observe how Paul's prescription for fixing these various problems in these churches is to install godly leadership. The implication being that churches need godly, mature leaders who can stand for the truth and who will refute error, as Paul points out in verse 9 specifically, and then again in those verses that follow. So in other words, churches are going to be strong or weak depending on the spiritual maturity and the doctrinal soundness of its leaders. And the significant thing about this list that we're going to be looking at here in just a few moments is that what Paul focuses on, both in this list and in the one that is also given in 1 Timothy 3 with some differences, the listing there of these characteristics of godly leaders has little to nothing to do with their abilities or with their gifts. It has everything to do with their spiritual, godly character. Both lists, here in Titus and in 1 Timothy 3, begin with the word blameless. You notice it in verse 6. It's repeated in verse 7. The meaning of that word is to be above reproach. That is the overall characteristic of the lives of these leaders in the churches. They are to be above reproach, and everything else falls in under that particular heading. But before we begin in taking a look at these characteristics, a couple of things I want you to remember as we go through these. The first thing I think that is worth noting is that the majority of these qualities are prescribed in other places in the New Testament for every believer, including women. So while I go through these qualities and you are evaluating me, which is going to be virtually impossible for you not to do, and that's fine, you should do that, but don't forget to evaluate yourselves as well. All right, I'm not just preaching about myself here, I'm preaching about what you need in your life as well. Because you will find a principle or a command that will correspond to virtually every one of these characteristics for all the people of God, but leaders especially. But keep in mind, the leaders that Paul is describing here and telling Titus to place in these churches are not found in the seminaries. They're found in the churches. These are individuals, these are men who have demonstrated these qualities, these characteristics in their own personal lives. They have developed into a place of maturity and godliness where now they are ready to be established as a leader, as an elder in these churches. So that's one thing to keep in mind. It's not just about me here, about you as well, and how you measure up to these characteristics. But then also I think something worth noting is that all of this takes time and effort. Spiritual maturity does not come about as some sort of a dramatic experience whereby we are instantly mature. It's a process. There is painstaking growth that takes place throughout the course of our lives. As Paul tells Timothy in 1 Timothy 4:7, discipline yourself for the purpose of godliness. Obviously, it's an athletic metaphor that Paul is using there. And as we all know, in order to succeed as an athlete, there is the need for discipline over the long haul. And that is what is required of us if we are to grow to a place of spiritual maturity. It's not going to come overnight. It's a long-term effort that we put forth as we discipline ourselves. And there's going to be some starts and some stops along the way. We're not talking about reaching a place of sinless perfection here. We understand that. But we're striving for godliness. And that, of course, should be something we are all desiring to do. Yes, we look for these characteristics in our leaders. We want them to be godly, spiritual men, of course. But we want that for ourselves as well, because we want to be pleasing to God. And we know that in order to do so, we must be making growth, taking effort, disciplining ourselves for that purpose, the purpose of godliness. So, we can group this listing under three headings, and that is this. We'll see that a godly leader is to be blameless in his home life, He is to be blameless in his character, and he is to be blameless in his doctrine. So let's get started with that first one, that first major theme here, or characteristic. And that is, again, a godly leader must demonstrate spiritual maturity in his home life. Paul puts it this way in verse 6, "If any be blameless, the husband of one wife, having faithful children, not accused of riot or unruly." And again, that term blameless or above reproach, probably some other translations of yours might have that there in its place. Both in verse 6 and again stated in verse 7, kind of serves, as I said, as kind of an overall characteristic of a man's life. It has the idea that if any accusation is made against him, it can't stick. And the enemy will come with accusations. In fact, the literal rendering of that word means not able to be held. Nothing can be held against him. He lives his life in such a way as a man of integrity that even his wife and children would affirm the fact that he displays the fruit of the Spirit in the home. They would acknowledge that he is a man of godly character who exercises and demonstrates servant leadership in the home. And so, if those closest to him can say that about him, then certainly there is nothing the world is able to hold against him, the enemy is able to charge him with, that is going to have any real merit, any real basis that's going to bring him down. The evidence is clear. The evidence would indicate that this is an individual with integrity, blameless, above reproach. Paul is going to show us here two ways in which that is going to be manifested in the home. How can he show himself to be a man of integrity, a man who is blameless in his home life? Two ways. Number one, he demonstrates spiritual maturity through his devotion to his wife. His devotion to his wife. He is, Paul says, the husband of one wife. Now, as you may know, you spend any time in church, that phrase of Paul's has brought with it a little bit of controversy, can we say? What exactly is Paul's intent there? What does Paul mean when he says that the elders are to be the husband of one wife? A literal way of rendering that phrase would be a one-woman man. If we were to try to make it as literal translation as we possibly could, that would be what it comes down to. The godly leader, the godly elder, is a one-woman man. And the same requirement is applied to deacons in 1 Timothy chapter 3. So what does that mean? What is Paul's intent with that? Well, the controversy really comes down to the idea that Paul is referring to a man not having been divorced. A man who's been divorced cannot serve as a leader in the church, particularly as an elder or as a deacon. But is that Paul's intent? Is that really what he means when he says that he is to be the husband of one wife? Well, there are differing viewpoints on this. I'll give you my viewpoint and explain what I think it means. I think quite simply, the literal rendering, I think, is self-explanatory. He is a one-woman man. He is devoted to his wife. He lives in such a way that it is made clear that he is not a womanizer. He does not flirt with other women, but he is devoted to his wife. She is first and foremost in his heart and in his affections. And he demonstrates that in the home through servant leadership. He demonstrates that in public. He doesn't belittle her. He doesn't make her feel unwanted. He is devoted to her. Now, if Paul had meant a man could not be divorced and serve as a leader in the church, Paul would have said that. There was ways of saying that clearly. And Paul was nothing else if not clear in what he has to say. But he doesn't use the word divorce. There is no indication that that is what Paul intends here. with what he is saying. Paul is not so concerned about a man's past. He's concerned about his present character. And I think that's the overriding point here. Is a man demonstrating spiritual maturity, godly character in his life here and now? Not sins of the past. Not something that went on back in his 20s or his 30s. Has he been married to a woman for a period of time and able to demonstrate in that marriage relationship that he is devoted to her? I think that's Paul's intent. I think that's what he wants us to grasp here. No accusation can be made against him that he is some sort of a flirt whose affections is divided among other women. He is devoted to his wife, and that is the overriding characteristic of his display of maturity, godly maturity in his life on a regular daily basis. He demonstrates spiritual maturity through his devotion to his wife. But also, we notice here that he demonstrates spiritual maturity through his relationship with his children. Now, the word children here implies small children. Again, we are looking at a man's example in his home life. Most children in their early years are going to embrace the beliefs of their parents. So are those parents instructing their children in the way of the Lord? Now, as they grow, they may start to question some of these things, but in their early years, while they are under the influence and the discipline of their parents, they should be reflecting the faith of their parents. And because their parents are intentionally teaching them and modeling faith to them and exerting loving discipline, their children are not becoming wild and disobedient, which is what Paul is saying there, not accused of riot or being unruly. So as you see the children growing up in their home, do we see that there is an influence of godliness that is being presented in the home in such a way that those children aren't becoming bitter? You know, Paul instructs fathers not to provoke their children to wrath. A godly father will not do that. He will not be provoking his children by belittling them or mistreating them in such a way that they become resentful and rebellious toward their parents, toward the faith. Paul says you can't be observing that in the home life of a man who's going to be placed in a position of leadership in the church. There needs to be a demonstration of servant leadership, loving discipline, the imparting of faith. If you're going to elevate an individual to a position of leadership in the church. Because if they're not exemplifying and modeling servant leadership in the home, you can be certain they will not be doing that in the church. They will be abusive. They will conduct their ministry in such a way that rather than bringing people on to faith and to nurturing and to growth, are going to turn people off. And Paul says we need to be careful of that. What's their home life look like? There needs to be indications of spiritual maturity among leaders in our churches. Let's go on. Secondly, we see that a godly leader must demonstrate spiritual maturity in his personal character. And that's verses 7 and 8. Again, we notice that word blameless or above reproach. And then what Paul does here is go on and he gives a listing of character matters, some negative, some positive. But again, as I already mentioned, I wanted to mention it again here. Notice what Paul focuses on. Again, it's not the skills of the individual. It's not impressive gifts. It's not a particular personality type. Those things may be important in certain ways, but that's not Paul's focus. That's not his emphasis here as he lays these things out for us. Again, his primary concern is a man's character. And so let's see here. Let's note these. We have listed here, first of all, 5 negative character flaws, things that should not be seen in the life of a church leader. an elder. And then he follows that up with 6 positive qualities that a leader should demonstrate in his life. So let me just note these. I'll go through them fairly quickly. I think probably most of them tend to speak for themselves, but we'll make a comment or two as we go along here. Starting with those negative character flaws. These things should not be present among church leaders. Let's note them. Starting there in verse 7, he must be blameless as the steward of God. Stewards, we know, are called to account, and leaders will certainly be taken into account. James puts it well. Don't be seeking after positions of leadership, knowing that you will all the more be accountable for that position. So he cautions would-be leaders to realize you're going to be held accountable for how you lead in the church. So we are stewards as church leaders. So how should they not live? How should they not be characterized by? Well, number one, church leaders must not be self-willed. The word there literally means self-pleasing. They don't put their desires first. It's not about them. The church is not theirs to govern as they desire and demand. They are not to be asserting their own rights, their own feelings and their own interests, and neglecting the feelings, the interests of others. There's such a good negative example of what Paul, I think, is saying here in the life of Diotrephes. If you remember him in 3 John, here's what John had to say about this character. He said, I wrote unto the church, but Diotrephes, who loveth to have the preeminence among them, receiveth us not. Wherefore, if I come, I will remember his deeds which he doeth, prating against us with malicious words, and not content therewith, neither doth he himself receive the brethren. And he forbiddeth them that would, and he casteth them out of the church. Diotrephes should not have had a position of leadership in the church. Here's an example of a self-willed man, a man who put his rights, his interests first. And if someone did not measure up to that, he threw him out. He didn't want anyone standing in the way and resisting his goals, his desires, his interests. That is what we are not to do as church leaders. That is a self-willed individual. Paul says those who are self-willed, self-pleasing, self-serving should not be in positions of church leadership. They must understand it's not about them. It's about the honor and glory of Jesus Christ. It's about the edification of the body of Christ. That is to be the goal of those who would lead in the churches. They must not be self-serving, self-willed. Secondly, church leaders must not be quick-tempered. As Paul puts it, not soon angry. They cannot be quick-tempered. A quick-tempered man is always a spark away from blowing up. He uses his anger to intimidate or control others to get his way. I would imagine Diotrephes to be a man with a quick temper who was quick to throw people out of the church. And I would assume he didn't do that graciously. He probably exploded in the process of kicking people out. Intimidation, using his anger to control. Patience, kindness, self-control, all of those are fruits of the Spirit. And they ought to govern a spiritually mature man. And one who is quick-tempered is certainly not living in evidence of the fruit of the Spirit at work in his life. Church leaders must not be quick-tempered. Third, they must not be addicted to wine, not given to wine. Addicted to wine is the idea here. The issue is that of reputation. Particularly, I think, in this regard, is he known to be a drinker? Or worse yet, a drunkard? Again, it'd be a stumbling block for that to be true in regard to a leader. Certainly many people have issue with wine, alcohol of any sort. Some suggesting Christians should not indulge at all. Others say a little bit here and there is fine. whatever your position is, I think we can all acknowledge that for a church leader to be given to drinking, to alcohol, can be a stumbling block. Certainly to a Christian maybe who is a newer Christian, new in the faith, maybe was an alcoholic prior to coming to Christ. You can see how, seeing a church leader who drinks freely, has no qualms about it, it could be a stumbling block to them. Could cause them to go right back to their old ways. It can be a stumbling block to Christians who have the conviction that alcohol is wrong of any sort. And so I think as church leaders, I think it's wise to have a conviction or a standard, whatever you want to call it, that will not partake. And I think that would be in keeping with what Paul is saying here for church leaders. Church leaders must not be addicted to wine. Whether partaking or not, certainly Paul's intent not to be known as someone who is an alcoholic or who cannot live without it. And so be careful of that, is Paul's instruction to us. Number 4, church leaders must not be violent. You see the word a striker. Physically hitting is the idea there, to take that literally. But I think we can expand it to refer to a man who would be verbally combative, who strikes out with the tongue, with his words. Again, this kind of goes along with that being quick-tempered. A quick-tempered man, one who loses control of his anger, is likely to just strike out, physically or verbally. So he's to control his anger. He doesn't respond to something that he doesn't like in a deacon's meeting by decking the guy. He keeps himself under control. Or he doesn't lash out verbally. A lot of churches, a lot of deacons' meetings have been filled with all sorts of awful things because the church leader, the pastor, can't control his anger. He doesn't like what's going on. And so he lashes out. And Paul says that can't be characteristic of those who are going to lead the church. Everything must be done decently and in order. And a man who is quick to anger, a man who strikes out, is not leading decently and in order. That's for certain. He must not be violent. Number 5, they must not be greedy. Filthy lucre. We're all familiar, I think, with that King James translation. But the idea is simply they can't love money. They cannot be greedy. A church leader can't be greedy because greedy men are not godly. They put something else first in their affections. And so they can't be a lover of money. If we think about the first qualification, a one-woman man devoted to his wife, you add in this one, how many ministries have been ruined by those two things in particular? Sexual immorality and a love for money, covetous, stealing from the church, embezzling funds, has happened to many. And it's ruined men, it's hurt churches, and ministries have been brought down more by those two things, I would say, than anything else. And so there's a caution here that we need to be aware of. Don't be a lover of money. Don't be greedy. A man who is greedy, he's likely to take advantage of people in his church, financially speaking. Or, as I say, he may be guilty of embezzling funds from the church, but it can ruin a ministry if a man cannot get that under control. Church leaders must not be greedy. Well, let's move on to the positive. And again, I'll try to move through these quickly. Positive characteristics that must be present among church leaders. Number 1, hospitable. Church leaders must be hospitable. Literal rendering a lover of strangers is the idea here. Very important in the early church, in light of the fact that there were not places for people to stay that were usually well kept. People traveling would depend on the graciousness and the hospitality of Christians, where they could go, where they could spend the night. They could be provided with a meal or two. So there was some cost involved. There were resources that would be expended here in displaying that sort of hospitality. We don't have that necessarily so much in our day and age. So I don't think it so much means that we have to be inviting people into our homes, particularly strangers into our homes. But still, the idea that we are a lover of strangers indicates that we are friendly, we are warm, we are welcoming. As it serves itself in the church, we open up our hearts to visitors that come in. If we're off in the corner talking to someone, we see visitors come in. I think to be hospitable, we leave that conversation, we go over to them, we introduce ourselves, we welcome them, that sort of thing. It's incumbent on church leaders to do that, to model that. But it's incumbent, I think, upon all of us, as we're all required to do. Romans 12:13, 1 Peter 4:9 indicates this is a call for all Christians to extend hospitality. Church leaders must be hospitable. Number 2, church leaders must love what is good. That would be a literal rendering of a lover of good men. They are known as lovers of what is good, what is virtuous. Number 3, church leaders must be sensible. We see that word sober there in verse 8. Paul's not going back to this idea of not being given to wine. He's already established the fact that church leaders are not to be drunkards. Here, that word sober means to be of sound mind, especially in the sense of not being impulsive. He's not quick to act based on just his emotions, but rather he is level-headed. He's not impulsive. He doesn't jump into things that are sinful or harmful. He has priorities. He has commitments. He lives in light of those things. He is sensible. Number 4, church leaders must be just. That word just often carries with it the idea of being righteous. But I think that's covered in the next word, devout. I think Paul means here with the idea of being just that he is fair. He is equitable in his dealings with others. He doesn't show favoritism, particularly towards those who are wealthy. Again, he's not a man who is greedy. He's not covetous. So he has no reason to coddle the wealthy, to try and butter them up and win them over. He doesn't show any sort of ignoring of the poor. But he is welcoming to all. He is just. He extends graciousness and kindness toward all. Number 5, a church leader is devout. This is the idea of holiness, practical holiness. He displays that in his life. He is separate from forms of sin and evil behavior. Not separate from sinners, as we know Jesus was the friend of sinners, but he doesn't carouse with sinners. He doesn't engage himself in their sin. He takes the word of God seriously. He takes his walk with God seriously. He is devout. He lives a holy, godly life. He pursues that on a regular basis, daily basis. And then finally, church leaders must be self-controlled. I think this so well sums up all of these characteristics. It starts out by the call to be blameless, above reproach. And that blamelessness is carried out by a high degree of self-discipline and self-control. So really this kind of summarizes, I think, all of these characteristics. Because a man who is not self-disciplined, who doesn't exercise self-control, who is not temperate, he is not going to be able to live up to and manifest these qualities that Paul has referenced here. That word temperate is used by Paul in 1 Corinthians 9:25, again in the metaphor of an athlete who exercises self-control in all things so that he can win that wreath. He doesn't do anything that would hinder him from his goal. And I think that's a good explanation here of what Paul intends here. They are able to control any sort of harmful desires that they may have, any habits that would interfere with their living out a victorious Christian life. There's got to be a high degree of self-control in the life of the leader. Number 3, we note here a godly leader must demonstrate spiritual maturity in his doctrine. We're going to come back to that next week and pick it up at verse 9 and continue on through verse 16 and looking at that particular area of qualities of a spiritual leader.